Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in just a couple minutes. Just wanted to make sure we could check our audio here. As soon as we're ready to begin, we're going to have the presenter introduced, and we'll begin from there.
Oversee the housing student conduct process here at the University of Michigan. I think one of the things that's important to know is a little bit about my background and my experience. I've always had, I guess, behavior or behavior-related association in terms of my career. I worked in residential treatment with aggressive adolescents before going to graduate school. Went to graduate school at Western Illinois, and then came here to the University of Michigan as a hall director, and then proceeded into the position I have right now where I oversee the student conduct process here. Here at the University of Michigan, we're really passionate about restorative justice and conflict resolution. And some of this concept may be new to many of you. Some of you may kind of hear kind of this growing buzz around restorative justice and really wanting to know what that's about and what it might involve. So hopefully today I can answer some of those questions and spark some interest in some of you. So I hope today to provide an overview of restorative justice, as well as talk a little bit about the integration of restorative justice into conflict resolution processes. I'll tell you a little bit about what we're doing here at the University of Michigan within housing, and share a little bit about some of the research that has been conducted out of my office and what we've found so far. So hopefully along the way, if you have questions, you can go ahead and chime in with those. We will pause about halfway through to take some questions, and then we'll continue on with the second half. So one of the things I like to get us started with is to kind of think about what our role is here as student conduct officers. So in some ways, sometimes we feel like we're here to kind of dismiss students and to discipline them. But this quote from Gary Pavella kind of illustrates kind of some of our goals that keep us more focused on being educational and kind of helping students learn and make amends and stay enrolled. And so a lot of restorative justice is really kind of tied to this quote and this idea that Gary Pavella puts out there. A lot of the work that one of the things to note is I will use some terms interchangeably. Because restorative justice is used a lot within the criminal justice system, I will use language like offender, but I will also use that interchangeably with language like respondent and complainant, impacted parties. I may from time to time use victim as well. So I just want to kind of put that out there as we get started. So a framework for what restorative justice is. So it's really a process to involve really those impacted parties who have a stake in an offense that's occurred, and to kind of heal and put things as right as possible. So we're really trying to look at a broad view of this. So it's not just the student who offended. It's also that impact on the community. The general principles of the restorative justice philosophy involve repairing harm, earning trust, and building community. And as you can imagine, this really has a nice tie to university housing, residence life programs, because it's so grounded in the community concept. When we talk about some of the core principles, the really great thing is it really has that accountability piece. And I think as professionals doing student conduct work, that's a piece that's really important. And sometimes it's difficult to get our students to kind of understand what it means to be accountable for something. And I know when I have conversations with students and I ask them, well, who was harmed in this situation? They kind of look at me kind of funny, and they're thinking, what do you talk about harm? Like, I'm in trouble. Just tell me what I need to do so I can get out of your office. But the thing about restorative justice that's really nice is it's more interactive. It really kind of engages the student to have a dialogue with you and to really talk about who was harmed and to be actively engaged in the decision making and the outcome. So they can't just kind of sit back and just let it happen to them. It's very inclusive, and there's a variety of ways to make that situation inclusive depending on what format or how you choose to utilize restorative justice, because it can be used in a one-on-one situation as well as in group situations. And it's very, very focused on harm. So you'll hear me repeat harm and rebuilding trust and reintegrating yourselves into reintegrating the students into the community. You'll keep hearing those concepts over and over again as we talk about restorative justice today. So one of the things to know about restorative justice, it's not a new practice. It's been around for a really long time. It's based on tribal and indigenous practices for peacemaking and responding to wrongdoing. It's one of the things I learned recently is there are still tribes that are using a talking stick and have kind of these peacemaking circles as a regular part or a regular ritual for their communities. And so I have some students here that are Native students who have shared some of what that experience is like, and it's helped to kind of inform some of the practices that we're doing here on our campus, which is phenomenal. A couple of key characteristics that are generally present in most restorative practices is that there is some sort of trained facilitator. The facilitators, their role is to be multi-partial and to have some intercultural maturity. We deal with a variety of students from a variety of backgrounds, and we want to try to make sure that we're cognizant of that. Communication styles can vary from individual to individual and situation to situation. When I talk about training, it's not like a formalized training that you have to go somewhere and get. There are trainings out there. An organization called Real Justice does do a facilitator training, but there are a lot of materials that you can access and kind of get yourself up to speed on what it would mean to be a good facilitator. Generally, the goal in our practices is to, again, identify that harm, figure out how to repair it, and who will implement it. Because one of our goals here is there's been trust that's been broken, and we want to help the student restore their status within the community and thus make the community whole again. Often our participants can be very broad-reaching. So participants in any sort of restorative practice could be the hall director and the student. It could be athletic coaches. It could be impacted community members. It could be parents. It can be pretty broad-reaching. We also often allow participants in restorative practices to be supporters of those individuals because coming face-to-face with that person that you directly harmed can be pretty scary. And we don't want to create an environment that's like a finger-pointing session. We really want it to be very supportive. So it is definitely a supportive process. Different types of practices, and I'll talk a little bit more about these in one of the future slides, but range anywhere from circle processes to conferences to one-on-ones to panels or boards. So as you can see, there's elements here that definitely can be implemented into just about any conflict resolution process. So the question is, why use it? It really empowers all the parties impacted by an incident. It's offering that healing and repairing the relationships. And you'll see it a little bit when I talk about some of the research that's been done here on our campus about how students have kind of responded to this opportunity to come together in a circle or to, talk about harm and how to go about repairing it. And it really has been instrumental in building stronger communities. One of the things to note is generally it's used when parties are coming voluntarily to a process, which isn't necessarily the case with our conduct process, but you can still use a lot of the principles from restorative justice to engage in those dialogues and help students understand the concept of harm and how to go about repairing it. It can either replace your student code conduct process or supplement it. So here on our campus, we actually utilize the principles throughout our process, but we also have a separate process called our Community Circle program that is solely based in restorative justice. And there's tons of different ways to kind of envision how you might go about implementing restorative justice. A couple of ways to kind of break this down. So we're all traditionally kind of socialized in a retributive justice model. And so I kind of bring up, when I discuss this with my RAs to try to help them kind of understand some of the differences, I do it through the framing of 3 different questions. And as you'll notice up on the screen, on the retributive justice side, it's really focused on the offender. What are they going to get? What has been broken? But then on the restorative justice side, it's more focused on everybody. So who's been hurt? What are the needs? What are the obligations that were created that then need to kind of be restored or repaired? Another way that this kind of breaks down that's also helpful to look at, again, between restorative justice and retributive justice is done in this way. So retributive justice is really focused on kind of that offender getting what they deserve. I'm out to get you, which is how we're socialized. And often when people are kind of trying to grasp this model, they'll be like, oh, restorative justice is so weak, like they need to be punished. But what we've really found through utilizing restorative models is that they're much more powerful because everyone's needs get met. It's not so offender-focused, and the victim or the complainant in the situation can really walk away feeling better that the offending student may not engage in this behavior again. Another important thing to think about as you're considering how to maybe utilize restorative justice principles is that restorative justice is really on a continuum. It goes from things that are fully restorative, like a peacemaking circle where folks are passing a talking stick and getting an opportunity to really talk about the impact and the harms, to things that aren't quite as restorative. So maybe implementing some of the concepts within your student conduct, like hearing process or arbitration process. And what you have to do is to really evaluate for yourselves and your campus as to how far on that spectrum you need to move, what makes sense for your environment, and what types of situations may dictate that as well. So a violation involving noise can maybe be a very fully restorative type of approach that you would do, whereas a situation that involves an act of violence, you would want to evaluate that more carefully and evaluate how restorative of a process you want to implement. So we really talk about here on our campus is trying to adapt to the situation and figure out what makes the most sense given the facts that we know entering the process. A little bit more about some of the different restorative justice practices that are out there. I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about these. They're really well laid out in Howard Zier's Little Book of Restorative Justice, and the information on that book is at the end of my PowerPoint presentation. It's a really great kind of starting book for those that are just trying to learn about restorative justice. It's a quick read, and it costs about $5 from Amazon. So if you're wanting to kind of bring your staff up to speed or your departments up to speed on this, it's a really good investment to get you started. But one of the things to note is, kind of the general restorative conferencing models are the peacemaking circle, there's victim-offender mediation, restorative group conferencing, and community reparation. And here in university housing, we also do kind of some of the things that are on the outside that talks about restitution and apologies, and those are all they are implemented through our arbitration process, and then we have a restorative group conferencing process, which is called a community circle here, just to give you a couple of examples of what's being done here on our campus. So here's kind of the core process that folks think about when they think about a restorative process. And if you look at this, it kind of probably looks like what many of your conduct processes look like, with a little bit different language. So we generally have some sort of initial meeting with the student. They get an opportunity to kind of talk about what happened, what was in the incident report. They review that. The piece that's a little bit different, so listing harms, I guess we could consider that kind of like our violations that they're charged with. But when we talk with students, we would really want them to focus beyond kind of just the violation and truly how broad the harm was. And then we work to find solutions. And that looks often and leading into kind of a sanctioning process. And here on our campus, we call that restorative measures. Here, generally, again, it's that voluntary piece that's focused on. That's generally what's been done in most restorative practices here on our campus. Students, it's not it's a voluntary meeting in terms of them coming. We can proceed without them. But generally, they kind of get the charge of, you have this meeting with the hall director, and they show up. So I don't know if it's truly voluntary, but it definitely is a meeting that we try to facilitate a restorative conference with the students. So it's nice here that, in general, restorative justice philosophy, it kind of marries nicely with our conduct and conflict resolution processes that are happening on all of our campuses. A couple of questions that are really good to kind of keep in mind when we're talking about restorative justice, and these can be infused really easily in the meetings that you're having with students currently, is what can be done to repair the harm. And so here we've listed a few different types of harm, and this is not an exhaustive list by any means, but just a couple of examples. So ways to repair emotional harm might be an apology. That could be face-to-face or in writing. Material harm, so they vandalized something, they broke a window, we would use restitution. Fines do not align with the restorative justice philosophy generally. And then for communal harm, it could be community service, it could be some sort of program or community building activity or educational piece. Sometimes we break out that communal harm into repair to the community as well as repair to the self. So if you think about an alcohol violation, self-reparation might involve them going to some sort of alcohol education program or participating in basics or something similar. And then we're really wanting some of these outcomes to focus on rebuilding the trust and trying to be intentional about it so that it's actually related to the harm that occurred. It's not arbitrary in any way. One of the things that kind of research in general, so overall nationwide, not just focused in education, has found is that the offenders are wanting a voice in the process. So they want to restore their reputation. They want to be able to provide an explanation for what happened. And some of them definitely want to take ownership. The research demonstrates that these types of processes reduce the recidivism rates, and they also increase compliance with sanctions, which is really great. And then it also helps the harmed parties or the victims in the situation. It gives them empowerment. It gives them an opportunity to have a voice. And sometimes I think they walk away not being able to say, hey, this is how this made me feel. And I need you to know that, and I need you to understand that. And it's also a much more inclusive process. And then the research for them demonstrates that it decreases their emotional trauma that they experience, and that they have a higher level of satisfaction compared to that in the court system. And that you'll see is echoed throughout the research that we've done here on our campus with our Community Circle program. So I want to pause here for just a second and see if there are any questions about the general information that I've provided so far about restorative justice before I dive in and talk about integrating that into the residence halls and talking specifically about the programs here on our campus.
If any of you have a question, you can type it in the chat function, or you can type it in the question area, and then we will ask Stacy that question. You can also raise your hand. Stacy, at this point, I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay, well, I will go ahead and continue on with the rest of my presentation then, and hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to answer any questions that might come up as well. So as I was talking about integrating restorative justice, we're going to spend some time talking about how to best integrate that into our residence halls. So the easiest way to really start to make the transition, if you're interested in kind of doing more restorative justice, is to think about the questions that you're asking in your standard meetings or hearings that you're having with the student. So at some point asking about who they believe was harmed in the situation. And sometimes that's a really difficult question for our students to answer. Like, they often are very me-centered and haven't really thought about, they're more focused on the fact that they got caught than the fact that they actually had an impact on others. So sometimes it's a little challenging question for them to answer, and also for them to get to see how broadly the impact was. But definitely a really great question to start getting students to think about the impact they have on others. You can ask them a little bit about, how they were harmed themselves, and go, what is the process that they can do to go about repairing that harm? What are their ideas that they have? And how they can go about making it right or repairing the relationship. So these are all really good questions that are commonly asked when we're meeting with students.
Stacy, I did get a couple of questions. Can I ask those now?
Absolutely.
One of the questions was, how long does the process take?
So I think it depends on if you're infusing it into your conflict resolution process. So if you're infusing it into what you already have set up as your hearing, it doesn't take any additional time. It's really just about asking some different questions and just really infusing those concepts of repairing the harm and identifying the harm and restoring the community. If you're going to go with a more formalized process of restorative justice, like a conference model or a community circle model, it depends on how you set it up. But those can take longer because they do have a lot more logistics involved with them. As I get to our process, that will be illustrated a little bit more in detail about there are more meetings involved with the community circle process, and obviously bringing a larger group together takes a little bit more time. I would say average for us from incident date to turning it around is about 3 weeks, whereas obviously our hall director meetings, the arbitration where they're just infusing it, most of those cases get turned around in a week to a week and a half.
Okay, and we had one other question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you ever use the standard student conduct, or do you ever use the standard student conduct standards in conjunction with RJ?
Absolutely. So as I talked a little bit about our kind of hall director meeting with the student, that's what we call an arbitration here. They are given notice. Everything pretty much, for those that are familiar with the model code of student conduct, is also in place, but we've supplemented it with some of these RJ concepts.
Great, thank you. Those are the only questions we have at this point.
Great. So as you're kind of thinking about infusing this into your process that you currently have, or start thinking about, making more a formalized conference model or a circle model, a couple of things to think about is to start to consider language changes. Those are some really small things that you can do on the front end. Just in the last year, we switched from sanctions to restorative measures to more accurately align with the philosophy that we use in our department. We inserted, when we were kind of starting this journey, we inserted additional information about the restorative justice philosophy into what we call here is our CLAM, which is our Community Living at Michigan Handbook, so that it was really transparent in terms of what we were hoping to achieve and how we approached our work with students when a policy violation or a community living standards violation occurred. And then again, back to kind of those questions, integrating those as you can to really get the students to kind of think about what happened in maybe a little bit different way. And some of you may be doing all of this already, but you weren't calling it restorative justice. So sometimes the semantics gets in the way as well. So just to kind of think about, there are some really simple ways to kind of start to infuse these ideas. I already talked about the sanction. And then also, really this helps us place that focus on the building of the community and repairing of the relationships, which I think many of us were already doing. We're just kind of making it more formal as we integrate restorative justice. And always one of the things that was really helpful here is keeping restorative justice at the forefront. So we have 3 core philosophies that we align with in our department, which are restorative justice, social justice, and our community development model. And those 3 things align really nicely. They have kind of this really nice marriage that goes on so that we talk about them kind of all the time and keep those at the forefront of our conversation, whether it's with our student staff, our professional staff, or even the students that we're interacting in. And we're always really transparent about that. We kind of put that out there as this is what we believe and this is who we are, from the point at we're recruiting staff to kind of become part of residence education to those students who meet with us for the first time. And we always are having ongoing training with staff and thinking of different ways to kind of help them understand restorative justice and have different opportunities to kind of engage around the conversation and practice. I try to introduce some sort of reading every year. Every new staff that comes here gets a copy of the Little Book of Restorative Justice just to help them frame kind of the work that we're doing around restorative justice. We also do a 40-minute presentation with our 300-plus student staff members on restorative justice and what that means for them as a staff member and how to interact with students using that philosophy. Another thing that was really, really instrumental in me kind of building our program from just infusing the concepts into what we currently had to actually building a more formalized community circle program was talking with colleagues at other institutions. We're all willing to share, as I'm willing to share, kind of what that journey has looked like, things that have worked, things that haven't worked. You can start small and pilot this in one area, and some of you that are individually can just use some of those questions I talked about. And folks that are doing restorative justice are usually pretty passionate about it and love the opportunity to share with others how great it is. So, if you need some of those contacts, by all means, my contact information will be at the end of this. I'm really happy to talk with you individually or direct you to others who are also doing great things on their campus that may look very different from what I'm doing here at Michigan. And then also, I think, thinking about what do you want that model on your campus to look like, and trying to think pretty broad-based, because there are all kinds of anomalies that come up, and you want to say, well, would it work with this or would it not work with this? So those are a few things as you're starting to think about if this is something that's kind of right for your campus, some ways you might go about infusing them. I want to give you a little bit about the history here and the time that it's taken to kind of make that transition into kind of where we are today. So restorative justice principles started being infused into the housing conflict resolution process in 2003. And when I say infused, it was really just here's what restorative justice is. We didn't talk a lot about this is how you should be using it in your practice, but here's this concept. Do you think this is something that might work here? Do you think this is something we should infuse in our work? And then over time, so year after year, we did a little bit more in terms of, okay, so here are some questions that we can ask during our process, here are some other transitions that we can make to make it more at the forefront of the work that we're doing with students. And it's been a slow process. So I think initially there was a little resistance to it. Folks saying it doesn't have any teeth, what impact, it takes more time. But over time, people saw the benefits of it and how it had an impact in terms of the community piece and what we were hearing from students, particularly who ended up participating in our Community Circle program. We piloted our Community Circles program and began in winter of 2008. So as you can see here, our number of respondents has greatly increased. And actually for this year, we have, I think we've already had 64 respondents. One of our first cases this year had 19 respondents in it, which was pretty exciting because it ended up being about 30 people in the room that we were doing a circle process with. We currently have 26 student facilitators. The facilitators, we did essentially a call out to folks who lived in university housing and asked them if they wanted a leadership opportunity with our office. And it's a volunteer opportunity. And we did some interviews and selections from the application process and selected 26 student facilitators. This was a niche that really surprised me because when we sent this out initially, I didn't think anyone would be interested in facilitating. And I had over 100 people apply. So we were a little overwhelmed by that and had to kind of figure out what do we do, because we can't manage and train 100 student facilitators. So we really had to be really selective about the skill set and the qualities that we were looking for in these facilitators. And it's continued to work pretty well. They participate in a day-long facilitation training, and then they have monthly ongoing training that they participate in. And generally, they facilitate, it depends on how many circles we have in a given year, but most people in a given year are facilitating anywhere from 2 to 4 circles. So I mentioned this earlier. So here in University of Michigan in housing, we have 2 processes for resolving conflict. So we have an arbitration, which looks very familiar to probably many of you in terms of a hall director meeting, that meeting with the student to kind of address a community living standards violation. And then our other option is a community circle process, which is reserved for students who are accepting responsibility and typically reserved for students who this is their first time offense. Some exceptions have been made to allow folks who are repeat offenses to participate in the community circle. The community circle can be seen as kind of an alternative conflict resolution by some because it is a process that if the student exits successfully, they don't have a student conduct record. If you set this up on your campus, you don't have to set it up in this way. This is what made the most sense for the environment here and for our campus and our students. For other campuses that do similar work, I've seen a variety of things. Some folks will use sentencing circles or sanctioning circles. Some folks have it completely separate from their student conduct process altogether. So it's really up to you as kind of the crafter or the architect of the process to determine what makes the most sense on your campus. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the community circle process because it's our more formalized mode. And so generally it's a welcome. We discuss ground rules. Everyone gets the opportunity to tell their story. If impacted parties can attend, we will read impact statements, which can have a lot of power. And generally there's a number of options to repair harm that are discussed. There's kind of this brainstorming, and then the agreement is created. And then the circle's closed. If the students complete everything in the agreement with the deadlines that were imposed, we keep information for statistical purposes, but it does not constitute a student conduct record. A little bit about our research is I wanted to share that some of the comments that we learned from the respondents who participated. And these are some pretty exciting things to be able to kind of see. Things that we'd like to hear about as working in housing, the respect, respecting the hall directors and the RAs more. A lot of what we hear from students participating in this process is that they felt funny coming, they felt uncomfortable around the RA since the situation was confronted, but now that they've participated in this process, it's really rebuilt that relationship with the RA and they feel much more comfortable around their approach. And here's a couple more comments. Those concepts of accountability, which is kind of one of our learning objectives in this process, is they kind of understand that and understand how their actions have impacted others, which is really important. A couple of things. Yep.
We have a question that I think might be appropriate here, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Could you please provide some examples of incidents where the community circle were most appropriate and had the best outcome?
Absolutely. So I would say generally we've had some alcohol transport situations where a student was extremely disruptive and I remember the young woman, she actually had to be strapped down on the stretcher and she was pulling on the door jambs and really causing a ruckus that woke a lot of people up. And so we actually had a circle that brought together kind of all of her friends that were there, as well as the housing security officers that were on the scene, and the hall director and the RAs. And that one worked really well. It's worked very well with bias-related incidents, although you do have to be thoughtful about your facilitation model and making sure that your facilitators are well prepared to facilitate a circle where there was a bias incident that occurred. We've used it, and it's been successful with vandalism situations. So we had a sprinkler, like a football hit the sprinkler head and like flood out a building. And so we had a circle, and that one was very successful, where we had the facility staff members come, as well as the DPS officers and the housing security officers to attend that, in addition to the impacted community members who had belongings that were ruined. So there's a pretty wide array of what we experience in university housing that are very appropriate for a community circle process.
And I had two other questions, if it works now, or I can save them till the end.
You can go ahead and give those to me now.
Okay. What is the frequency of the impacted parties not wanting to participate?
I think that that's an area when you first get started, that's a big challenge. We've kind of set an expectation around our res staff, like our the documenting RA as well as the home RA of the student, that there's kind of an expectation that they attend and they participate. The other impacted parties it's an area where we're building. I would say the frequency, I mean, we typically have like 1 or 2 impacted parties for every circle. There are some circles where we'll have larger numbers. I can recall maybe like 4 or 5 of the circles where people just out and out didn't want to participate in any way, either a written statement or in person, which isn't really high, but it can happen depending on the content of the incident. And sometimes it's a timing thing too.
And then the one other question that came is, what would FERPA enact with this? How would FERPA interact with this model?
So one of the pieces of the process is that all the participants sign a confidentiality agreement, and then that if there's information that occurs within the circle that would need to be taken outside of the circle, that we talk about it within the circle process before taking that information outside. Also, because we infuse the principles within our traditional arbitration process, it complies with FERPA completely, because we don't necessarily share that without the student because it's a partnership. Other questions?
Thank you. That's all that I have I see at this point.
Okay. So to kind of flip this a little bit, you heard what the respondents said, and I wanted to show you a little bit about what those who participated as impacted parties had to say about the process. And so our impacted parties have ranged anywhere from an athletic coach to a facility staff member to hall directors to our coordinator of our alcohol and other drug program. So we try to cast the net pretty wide. And generally, it's been pretty positive. We do on occasion get some feedback about the link, again, and the coordination of the logistics because it gets a little bit far out sometimes from the incident date that it occurred. A couple of more things. So we are doing a research study on the respondents and the participants in the community circle process. We're going to broaden that eventually to compare that with our current arbitration process. But just to kind of share a little bit about the initial data that we've gotten back so far. This question was, why would a responding student choose to participate in the circle? And as you can see, high for our students is to get the offense removed from the record. But then when we asked them to rank those that were most important to them, the top 2 reasons that they identified were to take direct responsibility and offer an apology. So, you know, while obviously the record piece has a bearing for our students and can be seen as a carrot somewhat, it's not necessarily about as much about the records as it is about repairing the harm for our students. Additionally, here's another slide, is that it's important to note, like, this is a conduct process, and students have gotten into trouble, and they come in expecting a punishment. But 4 out of 5 of the students that come in feel better about their community as a result of the process. So the process itself, and this is speaking specifically to the community circle, has a restorative and positive effect on their sense of community, not to mention the outcomes and restorative measures that's going to give them further opportunity to interact with the community. And then in terms of our satisfaction, again, our satisfaction rate on this process is extremely high. Generally, overall, either satisfied or very satisfied, 92.1%. I don't know if that would align very much with some of the other traditional adjudication processes that are happening on our respective campuses. And we were amazed when we started to get this data back about how overwhelmingly positive it was. And here's a question that we asked generally of the impacted parties. So that was the respondents before that had the high rate of satisfaction. And they are very satisfied as well. You know, 88.6 are satisfied with the process. So what now? So generally, here's some web resources, some books that are really great for getting started. And here's a list of some schools that are using restorative justice in a variety of different ways. So these are some opportunities for you to kind of start to seek out that information, evaluate for yourself if this is something that's right for your campus. I get lots of calls from lots of campuses who are really starting to think about how to infuse restorative justice into the work that they're doing. And I really encourage and then challenge you to think about doing that as well on your respective campuses. At this point, I can take questions for the last few minutes that we have. But my contact information is up here as well, and I really encourage you to feel free to contact me either via phone or email. I'm happy to share with you forms and resources and you know, training materials, things that might be helpful as you start to think about introducing the philosophies and the principles into the work that you're doing.
Stacy, it's Lori, and I've got a couple questions for you. The first question is, how does the task list and time commitment change for hall director staff that are using this model?
For them, I would say on the front end, it doesn't change too much. There is an additional, for those that participate as impacted parties in the community circle process, it would mean an additional time commitment there. Our circles generally run, depending on the size of them, about an hour. And most of those, the way we've set it up, they occur in the evening. We do that based on the students' schedules, and they all tend to happen in the evening. You don't have to set it up in that way if you're doing the circle process. So generally, the hall director on the front end, if a student accepts responsibility, will then offer, if it's appropriate for that case, the student the option to choose between continuing with an arbitration and kind of rolling into that restorative measures or sanctioning process, or to come to the community circle. And the students provided a brochure that outlines kind of everything that they can expect from the process. If they choose the community circle, it is then referred to my office, and I have a couple interns that work for me that assist in kind of the coordination and logistics of kind of putting it all together.
Great. There's also been a request to go back to the screen that has the references on it.
Yep.
And then here's a couple of other questions that we have. Will restorative justice work if the offenders do not take responsibility for their words or actions or have little or no interest in making amends? The example that they gave is derogatory terms being used.
Yeah, I think, I guess in the truest, purest sense of restorative justice, folks would probably say no. I personally would challenge that because I think that you can use some of those questions to dialogue with them about the impact that they're having on others, even though they may not be ready to hear that or ready to kind of change. At least kind of engaging in this dialogue around harm may help them to have a broader understanding of what occurred.
And we have another question. How do you handle situations when a student is technically a repeat offender, but the first was stricken from their record due to circle participation?
So we do take it into consideration so that we can determine whether or not to allow for them to participate in the circle again. Generally, that's not an opportunity that is extended to them. You know, other campuses do it different ways, so it may be done very differently at other institutions. But for us, it kind of looks like a first-time offender program, but it's not exclusively that way. So for instance, I had a student who had had a prior alcohol violation, and then he came through for a vandalism situation, and it made the most sense for him to go through a circle process. I've also, through our process, we have set up where they may participate in the circle, but we may determine because it was a repeat offense that it still counts as part of their record. But the student still really wanted to have the circle process to be able to come together with everyone so that he could share, you know, his accountability and his role in the situation.
And if we're going back to that as a follow-up question, so is the documented student, is it documented in the student's record as a first or a second offense?
It would be a first offense. So if they had the circle, that would not count as a record, but what I would disclose for like records or background checks would only be the second offense that counted.
Any other questions out there for Stacy? I appreciate all the questions that are coming through. I didn't get a chance when I started to come in. I'm Lori Berry. I'm the president of Glakuho, and I worked with Stacy yesterday and taking a look at the new technology. There was an awkward pause at the front because we had Anne-Marie Klotz was going to be doing a introduction. We had it all worked out, and for whatever reason, we had a technical glitch. So we appreciate that Stacy was able to get going and take us through this interesting topic. Any other questions that are out there? I'll use this time to make a couple of plugs for the upcoming conference. And then we'll get back to some questions because it looks like we have one that's coming up. The Multicultural Competency Institute, the pre-conference Identity Development and Intersectionality of Identities, where Dr. Dafina Lazarus-Stewart will be presenting, has a few more slots left. So if you're interested in that, please go online and do that. And the Community Service Project is still taking some applications. That's going to be at the Collinsville Area Recreation District, or CARD. And you can sign up by emailing Kiana Stone. That's qmstone@eiu.edu. All of that information is on the website. And we'll get back to one other question for you, Stacy. How do you coordinate the outside staff, such as DPS officers and custodians, to attend circles?
So we use timebridge.com. I'm sure some of you may be familiar. It's kind of like Doodle, but with TimeBridge, we identify 5 times. We base it on the respondents' class schedules because they're most important that they can all be in attendance. And then based on the information report as well as the impacted parties that the responding students identify as well as the hall director, we will send kind of notice out to them letting, acknowledging that we understand they're involved in the situation, they're invited to participate, and if they're not able to participate in person, that we would really appreciate an impact statement, and we provide them with guidelines of what should be included in an impact statement as well. And generally, we do have pretty good response rates. There was some relationship building that I did on the front end and also through the presentations that I've done across campus. So we did a research presentation on a lot of the data from the circle that generated a lot of buzz from particularly folks in the Division of Student Affairs having interest in what's this community circle thing all about, can I participate as an impacted community member? And they tend to provide a really great perspective at kind of a macro level. Even though they weren't directly involved, obviously there's that impact kind of to the institutional reputation and things like that.
Well, Stacy, thank you again for engaging us in this great topic. It is a great way for us to introduce what is going to be our contemporary issue for next year, which is student conduct. And we do appreciate the time that you took with us. And I will remind you that the recording of this webinar as well as the PowerPoints will be on the website. We will also send out to all of you that participated a evaluation so that you can tell us what you liked about it and give us some other feedback so that we can continue to bring these webinars to you. Any last questions before I do one final plug for our conference that's coming up? Okay, I'm not seeing any. Stacy, any final words for us?
No, I appreciate everyone for participating today and look forward to seeing programs developed on other campuses.
Thank you very much for all of you that are attending. I hope to see a lot of you at the GLUCUO conference if you're able to come, and if you are, and even if you aren't, we'd like to see you at upcoming webinars. Please go back to glucuho.org to check on what's coming up. Thank you and have a good morning.